The following program is brought to you by Caltech.
Our next speaker is Golan Levin. Because we're running a little bit behind, Golan has, and I think it would work best if we did not have questions after Golan's talk, and instead you find him and interrupt his lunch. Since we're a little bit behind, I'll make this very brief. Golan is the reason that I am in love with visualization. His passion is unmatched, and it was throughout my academic career. Every time I met with Golan, he basically completed the entire 3 months of thinking that I had in the first 2 sentences, and then went on to tell me what would be good to think about next. I hope you enjoy the speed at which he thinks. Let me introduce Professor at Carnegie Mellon, Golan Levin.
Beautiful, thank you. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. So I'm really delighted. This is a fantastic crowd. I love crowds that are from many different disciplines. My own courses at Carnegie Mellon, I've got students from 10 different departments, ranging from sophomores to doctoral students. It's like a one-room schoolhouse, and it's really great. It's a privilege to be able to address people with diverse interests like this, even just listening to some of the conversations out there. So I'm an artist who, I work in computation primarily as my medium. Some people call what I do computational interactive new media arts. Sometimes I do what looks like information visualization, and sometimes my work really spans a broad variety of things, including rapid prototyping. Last week, I just raised $500,000 on Kickstarter for some kind of bizarre little antique optical device. And now, but it just means that like my work is really diverse. And so I'm not coming to you necessarily with the same cred as some of the amazing folks who are speaking to you today in the area specifically of interactive information visualization, though I have done a little. So I'm really honored, actually, to be once again with Martin and Jer and Fernanda and many others who are really doing it day to day, working with large data. Today, I really want to focus on some themes that actually are picking up from some of the things that Jer said, specifically about the young woman asked about raising conversations and asking what's worth visualizing and why. I'm particularly interested in things that are maybe not as useful, but actually more provocative and stimulate the human mind and allow us to think in new ways about ourselves and the worlds around us. So things that provoke. And I hope you'll forgive me if some of the things that I'll show today are oldies but goodies. So we can begin, for example, with some of the most important overview graphics for us all to understand. Graphics can be particularly helpful for this. Here's Moore's Law, for example, one of the most important time series that have affected our lives so far. And here are 2 of the most important time series that will be affecting our lives to come: world population and global temperature. These are really important, and we need to understand these. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of poetry to these diagrams. So perhaps that's why that might be what they need to obtain the force that they deserve. And so today I'm going to discuss some poetic and tactical approaches to the concept of overviews and visualizations. And I can't even hope to be comprehensive. Maybe 10 years ago, I could give a lecture where I said, here are the 5 or 10 most important interactive information visualizations. And nowadays, if you follow blogs like Infosthetics and so forth, you know that there's 10 great new ones a week. So I'll just try and show some approaches, primarily but not exclusively from the arts. So as we think about yet other overviews, what are those gestures that can jolt us into new ways of thinking? Here, at the top, how many of you know this, by the way? A few, yeah, okay. This is a very interesting picture produced by astronomers. It's a picture of everything, the entire universe, from left to right, our solar system all the way to the Big Bang. A picture of not only all the stuff, but all the time, too. And there's a detail just down below. It's by Gott and Urich et al. And it's a logarithmic map of the universe, all the way back to the Big Bang. But here's another way of thinking about everything. Tom Friedman's cheeky Everything, which is a sheet of paper on which he's painstakingly written every word in the dictionary. It took him 3 years. It's written with ballpoint pen. And it, too, is a picture of everything we can imagine in words and in gestures. The arts and the sciences may have different truths to reveal, and both are good. So today, to borrow a diagram from Martin, which I really like a lot, it's possible to have a value scheme of useful, interesting, and beautiful. If useful is the apex here, then perhaps I'm interested in today's presentation in the stuff at the bottom. This happens to be my bias. I think many artists who are working with data and evidence locate themselves somewhere on this bottom edge. And most of the world that you know, the world of businesses and sciences, governments, departments of homeland security, and other apparatuses of surveillance are very much interested in the top corner. So it's very well trammeled, and there's a lot of money there, a lot of stuff to do there. The stuff at the bottom is less well understood. There's so little money there, in fact, that there's just really a wide open space of possibilities. Jared was talking about like exploding these prototypes out into the world that show us things we've never seen before. And many of the things I'll present today are in that bottom axis. Some of which are positioned culturally as artworks and some are not, and I don't necessarily care too much about the difference and labels. I like to think of information visualization metaphorically as a kind of a self-examination for society, in which we get to look at ourselves from a new angle and say, oh, I didn't know I looked like that. And this could be at the level of a single person, or it could be the entire world. And often these analyses begin with a simple question, which acts as a filter on all possible information. So I'll give some examples. Let's begin with self-portraiture. This is maybe self-portraiture circa, late 2012. Assuredly, the starting point for all of my first-year art students. What kind of self-portrait could this be? Well, recently those math geniuses over at Wolfram announced that they have introduced analytics for Facebook, so that you can analyze your own Facebook account and get this kind of display. Well, this is about time, all right? The users. This ushers in an amazing new era of quantified self-visualization porn. Go get it, all right? You'll scarcely remember a time this didn't exist. Well, what else was there? And what else could be? Here is a riposte. It's another quantified self-portrait, Taper by Tim Hawkinson. He has sliced a photograph of his body into thin strips and sorted them by width from the narrowest little finger to the widest part of his waist. Another one, also by Tim Hawkinson, even more conceptually extreme, is a completely reciprocal self-portrait, Blind Spot, which shows all of the parts of his own body that he himself cannot see with his eyes directly. So the question here is, who needs a self-portrait from a mirror? I already know what I look like, right? I can already see myself, except here. And so what's the algorithm? Well, he turns his head as far as he can crane it, and he has an assistant mark off on his body with a Sharpie the limit of where he can see. Then they photograph all the parts that he can't see and stitches them together into something like this. Here's a detail, right? So it's a self-portrait according to a simple algorithm, as I've just described, but which shows us, the results of a research investigation into something he cannot see of himself, right? Totally inverse kind of self-portrait than the one we normally think about. Okay, so here's a picture that we've seen before. Many of you know it's the Earth at night. And what I'd like to present, and Jared said, an image like this is now very typical, and yet even an image like this represents a kind of an answer to a question, which is putatively neutral, but actually has a kind of an ostensibly neutral question, like what does the Earth look like at night, but actually has really charged and interesting answers that serve as a focus for discussion. So how do we answer the question, what does the Earth look like at night? Well, you build a machine to answer it for you. And in this case, it's a kind of expensive machine that consists of a satellite and a camera, some transmissions back down to Earth, and some software to process it all. And you get this. But as much as this is that sort of neutral neutral process, we end up with a very charged picture. Right? Without surprise, we can see that Africa is literally a dark continent. We can see that America is, literally consuming 25% of the world's energy. We can see whaling fleets in the Pacific from Japan. We can see a row of dotted lines, a row of dots across Siberia, which are the towns that spring up across the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And we can see something like the Koreas and think about what's going on there, and the Korean Peninsula. So today I really want to talk about these kinds of visualizations that allow us to kind of interrogate them with different kinds of questions and which prompt further questions. Jer said question farming. I like this. I like question farming and discussion farming as the purpose of visualization. And so it's a very different approach than some of the folks in this very room who are concerned with getting some answers to some data that they have. Rather, how can we sort of create visualizations that prompt us into thinking new ways about what's really the case? So a project I like a lot, it's by Martin, he's sitting right here, which he made with his wife, is the baby name Voyager. So Martin, as you'll learn later, is an artist and designer and now co-director with Fernanda of the data visualization lab within Google. And some years ago, he developed this visualization from census data showing the rank of popularity of baby names from US Census data. And so you'll see that Barbara, for example, was really popular in the 40s. That's my mother's generation. And now, nowadays, not so much, but names like Brittany are on the rise. And this is just names that begin with the letter B. We can see that there's an overall shape to them as well. Here, even more dramatically, are names that begin with the letter I. It seems that around the mid-century, it just wasn't such a popular thing to name your kid with, but now it's on the rise, but particularly for boys' names, not girls. This is an enormously fun interactive project. I'm not going to show it for purposes of time, but it's the kind of thing that people can sit around together and talk about and say, well, let's try my name, let's try your name, let's try names that begin with X, and we see trends like, oh, let's look at names like Lexus, which is an automobile, and how those kinds of names like suddenly become, indicators of status or rapidly fall from being indicators of status. So to me, the fascinating purpose of this is not to create a tool to name your baby, but rather to have a tool that 6 people can sit around at a party and eat chips and discuss. And suddenly, the act of looking at data visualizations becomes a social activity that inspires us intellectually and aesthetically. Another project I like a lot is Ben Fry's very modest zip decode. How many of you are familiar with zip decode? It's a great little project from 2004. And I like how he discusses it. It's sort of similar to what Jer said. He says, so this project began as a very short sketch, just a few hours, that I created because I was curious about how the numbering works for postal codes in the States. So suppose I type in my zip code. I'm from 10309. 10309. Suddenly I can, oops, wrong, 10309. I'm from Staten Island, where I was born. We can suddenly begin to see the spatial logic of zip codes in ways that we couldn't before. The 9s are out west. The 8s are in the middle here. The 4s and 3s are in the middle over there. And this gives us suddenly a new way of seeing something that's data that has never been seen before, and about which, again, 6 people can sit around eating chips and explore the structure of a fairly arcane set of numbers and suddenly see how it relates to them. The idea that people can find themselves in this data is one that is very important to me, and one I'm sure that's important to many others who are speaking here today and out among you guys. Okay, so this is a project by Jesse Chris, who's one of my co-hosts here from JPL. When he was a student of mine at Carnegie Mellon, he made this project to investigate a fairly interesting set of data that no one had ever actually visualized before. There's a website, not by Jesse, called thebreaks.com, where people meticulously annotate the various samples of audio that are used in popular songs. So you might say, oh, well, Public Enemy uses a James Brown sample, for example, in one of their songs. And so people are constantly adding in this data, whether from the liner notes themselves or just because they happen to know the data really well. Well, when you plot this on 2 axes, here's 2 parallel axes. On the bottom are albums that have been sampled, and on the top are albums that contain samples. Suddenly we can see trends that we may have suspected, but never actually could see. So for example, we realized that there was a peak in people's use of sampling in terms of audio right around the early 1990s. That's like just when hip-hop was really starting to use sampling very, very extensively, and also when, of course, samplers became really cheap, because digital sampling had been around for some time, but not necessarily in a format that you could get as a street musician. Likewise, we can see that not only was the peak era of sampling in the early 90s with a resurgence after the dip in the grunge era back in the early 2000s, but suddenly we also see that it was truly the funk era of the early to mid 70s. James Brown, Sly and the Family Stone. That was the peak reference generation. We see a phase lag of 20 years between the music that was produced and the music that samples it. So for me, this becomes something you can also sort of investigate and see which albums sample which and which albums are sampled by whom, that people can sit around and use this as a way of investigating cultural phenomena that they haven't otherwise necessarily understood before. This is still online and worth checking out. A project of my own began as an investigation in 1997 when I was sitting, actually even before Google existed, at a browser some of you may have remembered called Alta Vista. And I was sitting there one day and I typed in a number, and just as then as now, you would get this kind of number in the upper part there that would tell you how many web pages contain your search term. right? So if I type in Michael Jackson, I'll get a big number. If I type in my own name, I'll get a much smaller number because he's more popular than I am, and that's fine. He can have it. But it's interesting that even today, you know, in today's web browser, Google still gives you just this one number. It's fascinating that, that the quality of your search is somehow encoded in this number that is all the sort of feedback you have as to whether your search term is too broad or too narrow. You know, if the number's too big, maybe you need to learn Googlish better and focus your search term. If it's too narrow, if it's too small, you need to widen things. So that number up there, let's call that the popularity, was something that I was interested in. And being bored and idle at work, I was in a cubicle at the time, I started typing in just various numbers. And if you type in a number like 910, you'll get, at the time that I did this, 84 million hits. If you type in a number like 912, you get 69 million hits. But if you type in a number like 911, something special is going on. Something is fraught here. Something is complicated, right? There's more hits for 911. Why? Lots of reasons, right? Lots and lots and lots of reasons. There's September 11th. There's the emergency phone call. There's even a model of Porsche automobile. So there's lots of reasons why somehow 911 means something special. And that's reflected in these numbers. By the way, you can't actually even see all 109 million hits if you were to go through all the pages. They cap you out at 1,000. So it's just really to kind of give you this kind of feedback. Well, I wrote a small program, which I ran whenever I kind of remembered to do so, periodically every 6 months or a year or so, to scrape all of these numbers out of Google and find out what was the popularity of every number from 1 to 1,000,000. And thus was born this project here called The Secret Lives of Numbers, which plots a big history of all these numbers from 0 to 1,000,000, and shows it 2 different ways. I'm grateful to Martin for actually suggesting the manner on the right. On the left, you've got a kind of a vertically oriented histogram that just shows, oh, there's 911, it's more popular than its neighbors. And you can begin to see certain patterns, like there's popularity on every 10, like 10s are more popular. There's 940, 950, 960, revealing our natural tendency to want to round numbers, even in some sense showing our predilection for numbers that are rounded to base 10, because we have 10 fingers. And then other numbers that sort of stick out there, like 911, which are somehow more significant. On the right is another visualization of the data that shows the same numbers, but organized in rows of 100, from 0 to 99, 100 to 199, and so forth. And so bright points stick out here. I'm going to try and show the real app. It's running over in Safari in a very old Java applet. And here it is. Okay. So let me just zoom in on this. Here we see some of these numbers and their various popularities. You can see there's 1,700, 1,800, 1,900, and I can kind of zoom in here. And we see something interesting happening right around up to the year 2000. Right? Of course, this data is from 1997 you're looking at. What's really happening there? Well, we see that more recent years, because we happen to use a date that's since a certain person was born or killed 2,000 years ago, we can see that certain years that are more recent figure more prominently in our writing about the world. The slope of this curve is our rate of forgetting. We can really see or make claims that the year 1970 is literally twice as important in our collective understanding of the world as 1950, which is twice as important to us as 1930. So here we can see about literally the relative importance of the past. There are some very interesting things that happen over here on the right. Let me see if I can kind of scroll them. This bright area shows the popularity of the first 10,000 numbers. And a very interesting thing happens along this diagonal. Those are numbers that rhyme, like 74, 74, or 73, 73, or 25, 25. And you might say to yourself, well, why might that be? Only when organizing it in this way do these patterns suddenly reveal themselves. And so my speculation is that if you're a pizza place or a taxi company, you want to have numbers like that in your phone number to make it easier to remember. Maybe the proof of this is this number down here. Right, oh, there. Nope, not that one. Let's scroll down. Sorry, I can't see it on my own screen. There it is. This is the number 12345. Popular simply because it's easier to remember. So here we have our 90210s and all the zip codes that are more important than others. The television shows, the 803086, 8486, 8586 processors that figure prominently in our lives. Over in the 75,000s, we have the French zip codes, the Paris zip codes. And there they are. Here are those are the 83, 86, 486, and 586, just as a little blip, to show this kind of way of thinking about the tax forms and zip codes and telephone numbers that matter more in our lives than others. In a certain sense, there's trillions of pieces of data that have been distilled into a visualization like this. And my hope is that by asking this kind of strange question about the world, we're able to bring it back to us and get an answer to something that we didn't even know we needed to ask, but that can tell us something new about ourselves. In this case, a slice through the collective unconscious, which is taking place purely through numbers. Okay. Those are visualizations of the outside world, the world of culture and the artist's body. But there are other things that cannot be photographed, but captured in other ways. And one of the final frontiers in our understanding is the human brain and language itself. Rob Seward is a young artist who's made a project called Death, Death, Death. It's a book that uses a database of word associations compiled from thousands of people. So here's Death, Death, Death. Word associations are an interesting feature out of psychology. If I say to you the word cat and I ask you what's the first word that comes into your mind, some of you will say dog, perhaps, or others will say meow, or something like that. You can collect this data from thousands of people, and it turns out that many people think in very similar ways. We have these association networks in the neurons in our brains that basically say, like, the word dog and the word cat are somehow, near each other in conceptual space. And people have published big databases of word association norms. And Rob, in this case, made a visualization of this project that I like a lot.
Death is a book written by an algorithm. It is derived from a word association database. The algorithm traces a path via associations between every word in the database and the word death. The book starts with words closely associated with death. As we move through the book, chains of association get longer and the paths get weirder. The book becomes a collection of morbid jokes. You can buy Death online for only $16.95. Go to robseward.com/DDD. That's robseward.com/DDD.
I like this visualization about death, partially as a rejoinder to the touchstones that we all have in the area of information visualization, the Jon Snow piece, which is about death, the Florence Nightingale piece, which is about death, and to think about other ways that we can maybe investigate this concept that we all are going to have to confront. So, some strategies. My talk today is going to be a random grab bag of things that I'm just going to blurt out at you, and my hope now is that some of them will inspire you and kind of give you stuff to think about over lunch, and you're just kind of like little explosions happening in your brain. Is there a structure? Well, I've organized it according to some basic strategies of how artists are using information visualization, and particularly how artists are using evidence to tell us new things about ourselves and the world. There are lots and lots of visual strategies. We've inherited a great wealth of them from the field of visual representation. Here's a menu of options by a fellow named A. Abela, and it's a kind of a flowchart for helping to choose how to visualize your work. Ben Fry, in his doctoral thesis, presents yet more options. Sometimes we can invent new ways, as some of the folks in this room have done, and others we can just use ways that exist. And even among ways that exist, there's a lot of options. Even for a fairly common operation like just showing a map of the world, there are so many options for which projection to use, and the choices are not neutral. Every choice is political and potentially highly manipulative too. Here's just 6 ways of showing South America using different projections that exist. So just digging in, I want to begin with talking about collections, small multiples, and holisms. Now, we're going to see a lot more collections later today, so I won't touch about the really old ones. I know that Anya Sylvia Going's talk is going to be talking a lot about 16th century and early scientific collections, but today I'll talk about primarily artist collections, which have been inspired by the same things, such as the 16th century wonder rooms or curiosity cabinets, or Wunderkammers, as they're called. But you don't have to be a professional scientist to make collections. In vernacular connoisseurship, we're all collectors, and people collect all sorts of things. You may not surprise you to learn that Richard Simmons collects photographs of Barbra Streisand. Here's someone who collects parasitic worms. Evidently, it's a calling. And people collect all manner of different kinds of things. I like this quote by Egon Kish. He says, "Nothing is more amazing than the simple truth. Nothing is more exotic than our own surroundings. Nothing is more fantastic in effect than objective description. And nothing is more remarkable than the time in which we live." There's simply a lot to be learned by what's around us. And artists have done their own interpretations of these kinds of phenomena of collecting. Klaus Oldenburg collected things that were shaped like ray guns. It's a collection of ray guns as well as objects in the shape of a ray gun, including even rusty scraps of metal having outlines vaguely resembling a right angle. And so these sort of problematize as, the relationship between the museum and the store. Is this a mall, shopping mall for ray guns, or is it a museum collection? And one of the most provocative exhibitions of the 1990s was Jim Shaw's thrift store paintings. It was an exhibition of 185 anonymous amateur paintings that he collected from thrift stores. And some of them were truly disturbing. A collection I like a lot is Portia Munson's Pink Project. She collected commercial products for adult women. The mere act of collecting them and reorganizing them reveals the extent to which their design infantilizes their owners. These are day-to-day products. Sometimes she presents them in a big heap, other times sort of sorted and organized. The artist Spencer Tunick creates collections of people, fortunately only temporary. But they allow us to see something about the public body, if you will. Those are collections built from available data. These collections already exist, but the artistic act of recreating them for public presentation is another way of thinking about things. I want to talk about the Band Writer series by Jennifer and Kevin McCoy. There's a website called Backstage Pass, not by them, where people compile the band writers that different bands have for, like, you know, I want to have a bowl of green M&Ms after my, in the backstage room after my show. And these band writers are pretty interesting sometimes. They reveal interesting things about the bands, and some of them sort of show how these bands take themselves to be understood, or the kinds of things that they want. Here, for example, is the band writer from Axel Rose. I've highlighted that he wants both Wonder Bread and Dom Perignon. Perhaps in Axel Rose's mind, this is not a contradiction of any sort. So what Jennifer and Kevin McCoy have done is actually simply visualize this. They go to a gallery who invites them, and they say, this is the shopping list. Okay? And from left to right, 9 Inch Nails, Jennifer Lopez, and Guns N' Roses. All right? So we see, for example, for 9 Inch Nails, he wants a carrot juicer and also cigarettes. This kind of weird mixture of, like, you know, healthy and unhealthy. So it's a way, just by seeing a collection of consumer products, that we can simultaneously understand our favorite bands as compilations of memes in a new way, and also understand consumer products, which we know so well from our own shopping experiences, as they relate to this matrix of music and popular culture. Small multiples is another strategy. This is a term from Tufte, who talks about how a uniform presentation of different elements of the same class can allow us to compare units themselves, but also create an understanding of the category. Typically, they're gridded. So here, for example, is a nice project by Wise Geek called What Does 200 Calories Look Like? You know, a huge amount of celery or a tiny pat of butter, right? A project that I really like from the 1980s by a photographer named Stacy Green is a project called Lipsticks. She noticed that her friend had a really remarkable lipstick shape. And this inspired her to find and ask other women if they would share with her their lipsticks. And she creates this kind of portrait with lipsticks of these different women. Now, it is not the case that you can learn everything you need to know about Roberta or Simone from these lipsticks, but you can certainly assert that there's some highly richly multidimensional qualitative information about their owners encoded in these objects, right? First, something about their complexion. Secondly, something about whether they're neat or tidy or fastidious or messy. And thirdly, this kind of a really incredible, like, 6-dimensional gesture through space involving all sorts of torques and rotations, which is encoded again and again through repetitive action. Okay. A project by artist George LaGrady, who has built systems for collecting people's belongings in this installation called Pocketful of Memories. It's basically a scanner. You put your objects out of your pockets, you scan them, you tag them, and then you can see other people who've also tagged the objects from their pockets in the same way. You learn the ways in which you're both similar to and different from other people around you. It's not just what people carry, but the vernacular design strategies that people use and have developed to negotiate our daily nomadism that is revealed by this project. Later on this summer, you'll be seeing a presentation on this stage from Aaron Koblen. A famous project of his is his sheep market, in which he collected systematically 10,000 sheep from workers on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, each of whom he paid 2 cents to draw a sheep facing to the left. So with computational systems, we needn't even depend on photography to obtain a kind of scientifically valid data collection. Just simply by asking the question in the most narrow possible way, we can really get fantastic results. So collections are rarely disordered, and usually some form of organizational principle is applied, such as sorting by some variable, weight or size, spatializing according to an underlying map, or some other logic like metaphoric or cinematic. This is a pumpkin map by Dennis Wood and his students of the town called Boylan Heights in South Carolina. The map is comprised of spatially indexed jack-o'-lanterns, and you can tell from this where the children in the town live. A project by a student of mine, a collection of gravestones from Pittsburgh Cemetery. The small multiples of the headstones have been plotted on a chart with the horizontal axis the year of birth and the vertical axis is the year of death. You can see this stripe of mostly men of different ages whose lives were cut short by World War II. And of course, if you zoom in, you see these different gravestones then in more interesting detail. So photography, from its very beginning in the 1830s, has been preoccupied with cataloging phenomena. Richard Roth has written, "The series is the backbone of photographic sensibility. It implies a belief in scientific method. One example is not sufficiently evidential. One might be a coincidence. But many, repeatedly, are compelling. They become proof." We see this in the well-known architectural studies of Bernd and Hillebecher. These photo series are organized into what Tufte calls small multiples, this uniform presentation. And in this case, it's these German houses, or these water tanks, or these water towers. Here's a photo series by Bill Sullivan, surreptitiously photographing people as they walk through New York City subway turnstiles. That subjective data could even consist of maps, something which we are nowadays accustomed to acquiring in very mechanical ways, is also possible. A project I like by Kim Dingle is one in which she asked Las Vegas teenagers to draw the United States from memory on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. She then just traced these and compiled them into a single large painting, which reveals as much about the Urgestalt of the United States' shape as it does about our citizens' appalling lack of geographic knowledge. This is a completely subjective experience, which can nonetheless acquire complete validity through visualization schemes like small multiples. Here are drawings made by Megan Combel, documenting her attempts to draw straight lines in her notebook while riding various subway lines in New York City. Okay? And as sort of idiosyncratic and personal as these experiences might seem, they're nevertheless intersubjectively valid. If you take the 7 line between Woodside and 52nd Street, it really is that bumpy. So creating a collection can sometimes be accomplished through a process of removal or filtering rather than accumulation. This is an example by Rutherford Chang, who blacked out everything but the faces from the front page of the New York Times. And he did so for an entire month, producing a 30-day calendar. The result tells exclusively of the people who made the news over the course of a month. You can see it was the month that Ronald Reagan died, and that Ray Charles died as well, and that they caught this terrorist just below Ronald Reagan, below the fold. This is a map by Kathy Prendergast called Lost. She's made a rather ambivalent map of the United States, which exclusively shows only the real places whose names begin with the word lost. Turns out there's a number of them in the United States: Lost Mountain, Lost Canyon, Lost Island. And one has to wonder if they're really on if they're on a map, are they really lost, right? Or has she found them in some sense, and by compiling them in this way? I'm going to skip that. A project of mine, which also filters the world. This is a project called The Dumpster. I'm not going to show it right now, but it's a way of filtering all the blogs from 2005. On Twitter, this would be a lot more trivial nowadays. There's APIs for doing stuff like this. But at the time, I was collaborating with a friend of mine who was, whose occupation was doing natural language processing for various governmental clients. Yeah, exactly. And the folks who have all your email and they're reading it. And my friend, who now actually works at Google, where he's still reading all your email. But at the time, he was charged with looking for terrorists It was 2005. You know, it's the modern era, right? That's our job now. If you know natural language, if you have a PhD in natural language processing from Carnegie Mellon, you're looking for terrorists. And he and I were chatting. We'd been roommates in college, and I was like, so what are you looking at? And he's like, well, right now we're looking at all the blogs. And I was like, well, are you finding terrorists there? And he's like, no, actually, it's mostly teenagers talking about their sex lives. And I was like, well, look, can we do a query? He's like, sure. So he pops up his special tool, and we decided to look for two phrases: broke up and dumped me. We got a couple 100,000 responses, and because he's smart, he knows how to filter them, so that we could eliminate all the cases where someone dumped Pepsi on me or where my favorite band broke up. And we got it down to about 90,000 reliable instances of blogs in 2005 where we were 90% confident that it was a romantic breakup. And so we compiled them into this visualization. And the idea behind this, which we published in Valentine's Day of 2006, the interesting thing is, you know, when you're a teenager and you have a romantic breakup, you think to yourself, nobody could possibly understand my pain. Nobody has ever felt this way. And what's interesting is not only are there a lot of people who felt that way, but they all use the same language in doing so. There's a fantastic technique called TF-IDF, very simple to implement. It's about a half page of code, term frequency, inverse document frequency. And it's one of these wonderful techniques from machine learning where you can basically create a metric of how similar two pieces of text are. Well, we ran the process on 90,000 different blog posts to compute the extent to which every single blog post was different from or alike to every other. And we were able to produce this kind of way where you could skip from person to person, each of whom was talking about their romantic breakup in remarkably similar ways, sometimes for very similar reasons. I had a really great conversation with Dana Boyd as to whether or not we should put deep links, which I think is something people would do nowadays. We decided not to, on her advice at the time in 2005, because so many of the breakups had to do with things like, my boyfriend broke up with me because I got pregnant, or you know, because I decided I was gay, or because there were drugs involved, and all kinds of you know, abuse and other kinds of situations that we decided not to produce deep links into. But it's interesting to see how much misery there is, and hopefully there was some way through this project that misery could find company. Sometimes new ways of understanding a collection can be achieved simply through rearranging an existing set. This could mean sorting or grouping it in an unexpected way. Tim Hawkinson's alphabetized alphabet rearranges the letters in an absolute phonetic order. So the alphabet that we've known since we were 1 or 2 years old, and which is so familiar to us, is here shown in a completely new and rather disturbing way. A, H, R, B, D, because W begins with D, right? Then comes W, then E, then F, then X, then L. So here they are, alphabetized. It's just a new way of seeing things that maybe we hadn't thought of before that gives us pause. This is Skymall Liberation by Evan Roth. I like this visualization because it was made completely without technology. Indeed, being on an airplane, it was made even completely without scissors. It's kind of brilliant. Here we have male and female faces from Skymall, right? Sorted left and right. Here, non-white and white faces from Skymall. So it's just a way that, you know, he's like one of these long transatlantic flights. What else are you going to do? Kind of things. But I think the result is really powerful. It tells us about this artifact that we've seen so many times, but never necessarily think of as a database to be queried, sorted, and filtered. Artist Fred Wilson does something like this professionally. He reorganizes the collections of museums, revealing their ideological agendas. In this case, he's gone to the Historical Society in Baltimore, and he's reorganized some of their metal objects. He shows metal objects that were made within just a couple miles of each other, within just a couple of years of each other. These are metal objects from the 1780s from a plantation near Baltimore. But he's reorganized them in such a way that you might not otherwise see such a set of objects collided. We have silver vessels in the Boston repoussé style, and we also have slave shackles. And by positioning them, we suddenly have a more rich picture of life in the 1780s and the kinds of metal objects that people had to make and people had to use. Another kind of reorganization happens with digital media very easily. Back to Jennifer and Kevin McCoy, they've made a project called Every Anvil, in which they've meticulously databased every single shot and scene from the Looney Tunes series and compiled them onto individual DVDs. There's a DVD which contains every every time someone falls, hangs in midair and then plops, right? Or every time someone runs into a tunnel and then the other one hits the wall and things like that. Every speed cloud, every running really fast, every lying in wait, every jetpack and rocket. So reorganization helps us understand the structure of the material and also offers a whimsical or oblique critique. Something that I like to show my informational and visualization students is this technique of image averaging, which has been with us now for a couple decades. It's very simple to do. It takes about 10 lines of code. The hard part is selecting the subject. The real and initial pioneer of this was Nancy Berson, who, as an artist in residence in MIT in the late 70s and early 80s, invented the technique of morphing. She immediately applied it to producing averages of beauties from the different decades. And this, on the left, average beauties, or the average of famous beauties from the 1950s, in this case Betty Davis, Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, Sophia Loren. And on the right, an average face of beauties from the 1970s and 80s, Jane Fonda, Diane Keaton, Brooke Shields, and so forth. Trying to understand through this kind of algorithmic technique something about the structure of popular representations of women and what beauty would be. A more recent project of hers is called Guys Who Look Like Jesus. These are self-selected individuals who responded to a Craigslist post. On the bottom right is the average. I think this is pretty interesting because, we don't really know what Jesus looked like, and yet we think we do well enough that, a bunch of guys are going to respond to a Craigslist post. Do you look like Jesus? If you so, get back to me. And there you have it. Now we know. A student of mine used a face detector and applied it for a single 24-hour period on 10 different television networks to create the average face of different television networks. And we see, that Fox News is the face of white male authority. BET is somewhere in the middle over there on top. It's no surprise, a darker face than the others. So here we can attempt to understand something about these networks and who they present to us as their voice and their face. Jason Salavon, a Chicago-based artist, has for a long number of years been producing really interesting work with the same technique. Here, he has 4 decades of Playboy centerfolds, averaged by decade. So every year, this is 120 centerfolds on each panel. Shows long-term trends in the ideal female form in media of Playboy towards thinner and blonder. Another project of his, again, we each think our special moments are unique. In his piece, 100 Special Moments, he's averaged together wedding photographs and children on the lap of Santa Claus, which he acquired from a Sears photographer, revealing the sort of cookie-cutter patterns that structure our lives. Also, houses for sale from different cities. And even just taking every frame from The Wizard of Oz, this is a project by Jim Campbell, averaged together, we can see the sort of the Technicolor world portrayed in The Wizard of Oz. Image alignment is another possibility. So photographic databases can be created by a simple query into the world, a kind of a filter. The question is, how should we organize the resulting images so that we might best browse or study the results? A project by a student, Cassandra Jones, is this one here. She's aligning all the suns in a sunset. Let's show a minute of this. So she's gone out and collected hundreds of photographs of sunsets, and using a simple tool in processing has created this kind of alignment of all the suns. It's very poetic. It takes exactly as much time to set as a real sunset does. So I'm not going to show you the whole thing, because it's a long and lovely sunset. But we learn as much about how the sunset figures in the popular imagination from this as we do about a strategy of organizing the world. This is a project called Pointer Pointer. Any of you know it? Lovely. They've collected a database of, here's my cursor, right? They've collected a database of pictures of people pointing. And there's an organizational strategy here. No matter where I move my cursor, there's enough pictures of people in the world pointing that you can do this. It's endless fun. There it is. Okay. I could show this all day. Okay. So it's again a way of thinking about aligning images and then using an interactive query into a database to tell us something about the world that maybe we hadn't seen organized or compiled that way before. Many of you are in the business of making maps. When I think about artist approaches to maps, there are many. When we make a map, we're really talking about making a human-scale representation of a place. This is an assemblage and photograph by Gabriel Orozco. Even entirely subjective things can be mapped. This here combines a map and a graph. Owing to the routine trajectories and schedules of air travel, we can really imagine a certain place over the Atlantic where coffee occurs. Saul Steinberg frequently had to fly overseas, but never quite accommodated to it. Owing to the constancy of his own personality, we can really imagine a certain place over the Atlantic where paranoia occurs. For him, anyway. And as you can see, he didn't really like flying very much. But to think of this as a kind of a subjectively valid map that says there's a certain place in the ocean which is the place where Danish happens is something that I find quite poetic. Much has been made of the ways in which our brains consider maps versus routes. And we encode terrain in embodied ways which embed our personal experience. The act of mapping a previously unconsidered detail can be a poetic one. Here, Orozco has made a map of the spires and minarets he sees from his hotel window. It's a map from a very specific perspective, here slightly misaligned with the camera, but what map isn't? Right, he's just put coins on the windows. Robert Venturi created this map, well-known map of Las Vegas, from the texts of the street signs there, their size proportionally and shown in their actual relative orientations. A map which is wholly constructed from the data it represents is Brandon Martin Anderson's census.map, which some of you may have seen recently. Map. This is a great project which is worth spending time with, but what Brandon did here was he created one dot for every person in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, compiling those from the census collected from the 3 different governments. If you zoom in, what looks like a smudge in any given town or city is actually a set of dots where each dot represents a single person. Here you can begin to see them, okay, in those census tracts. So it's interesting to think of this idea of not positioning data on a map, but rather growing a map from the data itself, that the data is enough to form and constitute the map for you. Okay. Back to here. I'm, in respect of your time, going to blast through a few last things. Mark Bennett is an interesting artist who has meticulously created blueprints for fictional houses that he's seen on television shows. Here is the home of the Addams Family. Here, the home of Bewitched, Darren and Samantha Stevens. Here, Ward and June Cleaver from Leave It to Beaver, and Gilligan's Island, and Laverne and Shirley. Now, remember, these are actually not coherent architectures in the real world. If you go and visit the actual sound stages where these are recorded, each room has its own studio audience. They're only attached through video editing, right? They're not actually attached in the real world. But by watching these shows over and over and over again, he collects this data and then presents it in this kind of distilled form. I think it's important to remember also that maps can be created on the fly in real time interactively. This is a dynamic map by Scott Snibbe. It shows a Voronoi diagram of the people who are standing on a given sort of dynamic projection. So in this case, the lines represent the boundaries between people's personal spaces as computed by the Voronoi algorithm. Essentially, each line divides a space between two people into the parts of the plane that are closer to them than any other. So as a map, it can be an interactively and generatively based artifact as well. My last thing I'm going to present today is a topic of holisms. I've made up this word because I can't find a better one for it. But it's the presentation of an exhaustible or finite data set in its entirety, or visualizations which, taken as wholes, organically reveal the influence of a complex set of forces. This is a project by Michael Gray called Erosion Blocks, which shows every possible way of removing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 surfaces from a pewter block. Back to Tim Hawkinson again. All of the dental impression compound that my mouth could contain, cast in lead. You have to imagine this proprioceptively, how this was made, right? It had to, you could almost see it slipping down the back of his throat. But it is truly a visualization of an absolute limit, right? Also by Tim Hawkinson, Alphabetized Soup. It's a histogram of the letters in an entire can. Notice there's actually a lot of letter I's. Something that Martin made, color code. If you can imagine that the WordNet database of 33,000 words is an approximation to the entire English language, then this is a visualization of the entire English language, where he's scraped the color of every word by averaging together Google images that contain that word or that are tagged by that word, and then creating a kind of a tree map where people can see, oh, look, flowers are kind of pink or green. Most of the image is brown, Martin asserts, because a lot of our words in our vocabulary are about people, and people are sort of brownish pink. A project I like a lot is by Komar and Melamed. Stop me if you've heard this one, but it's a great project. They did an extensive survey of people's tastes in paintings. They said, what's your favorite color? Do you like large paintings or small paintings? What kinds of subjects do you like? Do you like outdoors or indoor subjects? Do you like paintings that have forests and animals and historic figures and buildings and children? And they did this through an extensive series of web forms, basically web surveys, and also through phone interviews by paying a professional survey company to conduct telephone surveys of thousands of people. After compiling all this data, and they basically then produced the United States' most wanted painting. Okay? It's this kind of synthesized whole that represents a completely data-driven response to the data they've collected. It's mostly blue and some green. It has historic figures and animals, natural scene. Okay. By the way, when you know what the most wanted painting is, you also know what the least wanted painting is. And they did this for 10 different countries. Here we can actually now create see a series of small multiples that compiles the various tastes of these nations, putatively represented by their most wanted and least wanted paintings. We notice that the Dutch are the only ones who really prefer abstraction, and that the Italians just can't bear the weight and pressure of their history. Okay. A project I like by Kevon Davis uses crowdsourcing to create a visualization of the collective unconscious's idea of what the alphabet should look like. There's a web form where it says to you, the collective unconscious is trying to create the letter A. Should the pink pixel or the orange pixel be black or white? And you get to choose, and after a cookie is set, you can only choose 3 times, and then it asks you about a different letter. Well, after 12,000 flips, this is what the internet has created. They've created a single pixel at a time what the letter A looks like. And in a series of animations of the progress of these forms, as they resolve from complete noise into complete order, you can see, thousands of people, in this case 12,000 people so far, who are arguing as to whether or not it should have serifs, right? The last project I'm going to show is some new work by Heather Dewey Hagborg. I highly recommend you check out her work. She creates portrait sculptures from analyses of genetic material collected in public places. What does that mean? She goes to a urinal and plucks off a pubic hair. She does a genomic analysis of that, okay? And it turns out that from the genome in that piece of hair, you can find out almost exactly what someone looked like. Yeah, this is real. She then creates 3D printed sculptures of those people. Working with the traces strangers unwittingly leave behind, Dewey Hagborg calls attention to the impulse toward genetic determinism and the potential for a culture of genetic surveillance. With that, I have to leave you with the best overview of all, this one. Thank you so much for your time.